Welcome to Blindspot. I'm Steve Reardon. My guest today is Thomas H. Henriksen, who is an emeritus senior fellow at the Hoover Institute, where he focuses on American foreign policy, international political affairs, and insurgencies. He specializes in the study of U.S. diplomatic and military courses of action towards terrorist havens in the non-Western world and towards rogue regimes. His most recent book, Eyes, Ears, and Daggers, Special Operations Forces and the Central Intelligence Agency in America's Evolving Struggle Against Terrorism, will be published by the Hoover Press in October 2016. He is also a senior fellow at the U.S. Joint Special Operations University, where he concentrates on counterinsurgency practices. Thomas Henriksen, welcome to Blindspot.
Thank you.
So I wanted to start out just talking about your most recent book, Eyes, Ears, and Daggers. Your book evaluates the history and I guess the current status of the intersection of special forces and the CIA. Maybe you can just briefly touch on why this is relevant in our current climate.
Well, I think it's very relevant because the United States is in a war against terrorism, with the largest battle so far, I think, with a direct contact of 9/11 on the United States, the terrorist attack. And since then, I think these two particular security agencies, the Special Forces and the Central Intelligence Agency, have come together. They have had a long history of some feuding, some collaboration over the decades, which really stems from the period of time after World War II, with the standing up first of a Central Intelligence Agency, which grew out of the Office of Strategic Services, a very famous and very flamboyant OSS of World War II fame. And the CIA was given birth in the late 1940s, at the same time that the Special Forces were reconstituted. There have been Special Forces types of units during World War II, but they were put together. And the two do have a kind of overlap. And the overlap is always where friction happens. When spies become soldiers or soldiers become spies, when spies take up the missions of the military or the military takes up missions of the spies, that causes the problems between the two. And I think that was resolved, at least to a very good, close working relationship after the 9/11 attack. And I think it's because the two agencies decided they have to get this right. They can no longer engage in these petty feuds, and it did come together fairly well.
Right, and I think that's very much in the book, that where this intersection has happened, it's mostly been successful. I guess you have some recommendations for their continued involvement and kind of success going forward. How do you see this playing out kind of over the future?
Well, I think the biggest thing will be that the two continue to collaborate and talk with an open era. That is hard to do. It's very easy for people on the bottom to do this, those in the trenches, so to speak. But at the top end, it's harder because there are also budget fights. Both sides want to have prestige. They want to be called attention to, but they're really doing very good. So there's this competition inside the Beltway. People outside the Beltway don't really care. They just want it to be done right. But inside the Beltway, these little squabbles take on great significance. And so consequently, there is a tendency to exaggerate petty feuds. So that's also a worry. Some commentators said that we are actually now in a post-honeymoon mode between the two. That is to say, we were much closer just a few years ago. So the idea, one of the recommendations was that both keep within their parallel units, but include each other early on in the planning. In other words, if you bring somebody in late from either from one side or the other, then they don't have the same buy-in. They don't have the same reason to collaborate. So you have to bring them in. And that was done, for example, on the famous raid to net Osama bin Laden. They brought, when the Central Intelligence Agency had identified pretty clearly where he was in Abbottabad, Pakistan, the Navy SEALs were brought in because the Navy SEALs were more or less in charge, if you can use that term, of Afghanistan. The Delta Force were more in charge or running things in Iraq. So the SEALs were brought in through JSOU, which is a Joint Special Operations Center, was brought in to work very closely with the CIA. And so I think it worked out well between the two.
I wanted to ask something just that I took out of the book. You talk a little bit about kind of Title 10 and Title 50 and the overlap and ambiguities of these titles. What are you specifically referring to there?
Well, and the Title 50 and Title 10 come from the U.S. Code. There's codes laid down, and these were really set up many, many years ago. Title 10 pertains to the military, and it's how they conduct operations, who they report to. Title 50 is more is a purview over the Central Intelligence or spy operations. And let me just give you a couple how this works out. It was very clear when the Osama bin Laden raid took place that Leon Panetta, who was head of the CIA at that time, made it very clear this is a Title 50 operation, not a Title 10. And he meant by that it's a secret operation conducted clandestinely with reporting relationships from the president to the director of Central Intelligence to the Special Forces. It was not a military operation, and that was a kind of fig leaf in a way, because the Pakistanis, had it been a real military invasion, not just a secret raid, would have had to respond. And so it enabled the Pakistanis to kind of wink and nod and get on with things. But if it had been a formalized military operation under Title 10, then that would have been an invasion, and that would have really caused the Pakistanis to be very upset. So many times it works out for the benefit of the United States, not so much from people who are interfered with. The reporting relationship, as most special forces and the CIA will tell you, however, the problem is not with the executive branch. The problem's with the Senate committees that oversee these operations. For example, Title 10, the military operations, military code, are overseen by the Senate and the House committees on armed forces or armed services. They oversee. They ask a lot of questions. If it's a Title 50, which is a so-called CIA secret one, then they're overseen by the House and Senate intelligence committees, and they are sometimes a much more difficult bailiwick for the special operations forces to deal with than the Pentagon or the White House. So sometimes they're unnecessarily obtruse and complex, which leads, and one of the reasons people think maybe we could straighten this out and make it better. Other people say it works, leave it alone. But many people said it is too convoluted and should be streamlined.
Well, I think, one of the things that Title 50 brings me into is kind of this wading into this sort of gray area of legality, right? So as you mentioned, the Title 50 meant that it wasn't a formal invasion in Pakistan. And I guess linked to this is maybe the legality around drone strikes, right? So there have been a lot of commenters who are saying, it's very legally gray. Do you think we should be paying more attention to this? Rosa Brooks got a very good new book out where she talks about this in depth. What is your view on this? And should we have more attention, and kind of what are the sort of solutions you think? Well,
it leads to a larger area. Some people think the Central Intelligence Agency, for example, should return to just spying, that it should produce intelligence information which decision makers in Washington can use. That is to say, back to the 1950s and 60s when the Central Intelligence Agency spent a great deal of time to try to understand what was going on inside the Kremlin, or how the Soviet nuclear forces were being constructed, what their latest breakthroughs were in missiles and so forth, sort of big picture things. And they should stay out of the mundane, small killing operations that drag them away from these big issues and bring them down to a level of lethality and killing that really belong properly in the military. I think some of those people that express that viewpoint are against the whole idea of drone strikes anyway, and it's just a way of attacking that. Drone strikes of killing terrorists are highly effective. They've been very successful, and I think the American public likes the idea. Because it exposes the terrorists more than it does soldiers on the ground, and it keeps American casualties low. But there are voices, particularly on the left, against these strikes. And sometimes they use the issues of Title 10, Title 50, what the CIA should be doing, as a cudgel against those tactics of the kinetic operations undertaken by drone strikes.
I mean, I guess to push you, what is your view on that? I mean, are you think it does more good than harm?
I do think that, however, it might be reformed. I think the option of having the CIA have some drone strike capability is a good one.
Right.
It's down to just Pakistan now. Recently, they turned over most of the lethal operations, say in Yemen, which was the other place, to the military. Are now operating those. The CIA was highly effective at that, and sometimes the military had some difficulties in Yemen, but the military's also carried out raids in places like Somalia. Not all are drone strikes. Some are commando raids in both Iraq and also in Syria. And those have been a part of special operation forces for a long time, where they do these sort of commando type raids to net a terrorist. Sometimes they're done not to kill a terrorist, that may happen, but they're to capture and therefore try to interrogate and try to capture more information from a terrorist. So sometimes they're used in that sense. But there is this idea that the CIA has become too militarized, and its customer is solely the military as opposed to what it should be doing, is producing this big level intelligence, say spying on what China's up to or what Russia's up to, rather than being called into the trenches in places like Yemen and Syria.
So I want to just touch on special forces for a moment. It's clearly a branch of the military that's been growing. It's kind of the weapon of choice in the global war on terror. And I guess looking at it compared to the conventional U.S. military forces, one of them kind of feels like more of a deterrent against Russia, China. The other one feels like more of a weapon against the war on terror. How do you see the role of conventional forces playing out over the coming years? Is there still a big role for a large number of conventional sort of ground troops and artillery in the future?
Absolutely. Special forces are very small, first. The figure given recently is around 70,000. The Marine Corps is about 175,000. The Army is about 450,000. It's very tiny. And all those people in the Special Operations Command are not Delta or SEALs. They're people simply who fight their war with a desktop computer. So there's a lot of support staffs. The actual Special Operations Forces, the ones that really are at the head of the spear, theirs are very small. The numbers are all classified. We have an idea of how big they are. But all of these forces, both the Special Operations Forces and the regular forces, do a lot of training of indigenous people. That is to say, the host nation. It could be in Iraq, it could be in Libya, it could be in Somalia. And that is a big mission, training forces against terrorism. And the special forces can't do it alone. They do need help. And that happens, it's happening today in Iraq. For example, it's not just Special Operations Forces helping the Iraqi forces, or it's not just the CIA doing some of the training. There are actual ground, regular armed forces in those places helping out. So they're very much needed in that. And we don't see the Special Operations Forces use the conventional war, except usually as support missions. They might carry out a raid, they might carry out some sort of seizing operation, such as they took over oil well platforms in both Iraq wars. They did that, or looked for Scud missile sites and things of that sort, firing from Iraq into, say, Israel or into Saudi Arabia. So they still have those missions, but those missions are largely support missions of a larger operation. So, but when it comes to terrorist operations, manhunting operations, the Special Operations Forces have an edge there that the conventional military does not have.
Right. So you're clearly an expert on U.S. foreign policy and military affairs. Let me ask you, what keeps you up at night?
I think recently, well, there's always the untoward event from the terrorists. If they do something like on 9/11, that, of course, could happen. And too many people have written it off and say, well, they don't pose an existential threat to the United States. That's true. They don't. Terrorists don't pose, as we know now, unless they happen to get a nuclear weapon, then they would pose a much greater threat. The two, I think, are, of course, the rise of China and Russia, and how America has, in the last several years, has found itself outflanked in some significant geopolitical ways. Say before the current administration came to power, we had an ally in China, and that's gone now. China's not our ally. The Kissinger-Nixon idea of bringing China in against the Soviet Union, this great breakthrough in 1970, that has been lost. That now China and Russia are collaborating. That wasn't there before. Now we also have the situation where Iran not only is a threat in conventional terms and terrorist terms, but also has made an alliance. These may be tactical alliances and alliances of convenience between Iran and, say, Russia, or Iran and Syria. But nonetheless, those alliances are a fact we have to think about. Those weren't around a few years ago. So the whole picture geopolitically has switched against the United States. It looks like almost the odd man out sometimes. Now, we have very good allies still in NATO, and we're trying to cultivate new allies in places like Vietnam. But it still is not a rosy picture. That we have this kind of conspiracy of powers against us who have one thing in common. They don't like the United States. They may have differences in other areas, and the relationships may be somewhat tangential or fleeting. Nonetheless, they're relationships we have to think about.
Right. I mean, so I was going to sort of ask you about what is your general assessment about U.S. foreign policy at the moment, but I guess you touched on the idea that the U.S. has been outflanked over the last few decades. I mean, why is that?
I think it's a conspiracy of many things. I think some of the idea was we look like we didn't want to play internationally. There has been this kind of retrenchment mode. And I understand the origin of it. People were tired of the Iraq War and also the Afghanistan War, but I don't think great powers can get tired in the normal sense. They just can't be that way. And we looked like we were projecting weakness, that we couldn't be counted on. And so I think people outside the United States grasp that very quickly. And they will soon start to challenge you, as Putin has challenged the United States in Syria, by seizure of the Crimea, and also by his actions in and against eastern Ukraine. Now he's also flirting with some sort of activity in the Baltics. They're also putting pressure on the Republic of Georgia. And so Putin and his forces look like they're somewhat in the ascendancy. He might be very weak economically, but they still can cause a great deal of damage. And the same is clearly true of China, which has tried to make the South China Sea a Chinese lake. And so America doesn't look like it's stepping up, but it's too passive, it's too withdrawn, and that causes questions, I think, in other powers' minds, how much we're really interested in defending ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, so you brought up Syria. I think it's obviously on everyone's mind at the moment and spoken about a lot, just because I think it's such a proxy or a touchstone for exactly what you're talking about. I mean, what is your assessment of what the U.S. did wrong in Syria, and what would you have liked, I guess, the current administration to have done?
At the very beginning of the Arab Spring, in the early part of 2011, we didn't do very much. We looked passive. We looked where we were, rather than seeing this as some sort of giant advantage the United States could capture and perhaps guide into democracy, as these local strongmen were overthrown in places like Tunisia and Libya and Syria and Yemen. We looked as if we were going to lead from behind, a very unfortunate phrase, and looked as if America really didn't care. This was so passive from the previous administration, but it intervened repeatedly and at least showed a strong face toward democracy. Revolutions were taking place in, such as in Lebanon, and also in Georgia, and in any place like we don't think of much as Haiti, and Sierra Leone. The previous administration intervened somewhat, even if it just sent a ship to show the colors, so to speak, it did something. We looked passive. That was one thing. The second thing, I think, the most grievous era was when Bashar Assad in Syria began to use chemical weapons, and the administration, President Obama, said it's a red line. And then they crossed the red line, there were no consequences. That is the worst thing you can do. Positively terrible. If you're not willing to fight for something, don't say it. If you're going to say something's not acceptable, be prepared to counter it. But if you say it and then let somebody cross the red line, then you look very weak and helpless. And I think that was one of the turning points when that happened in the spring of 2014. It made America look like it wasn't going to step up and do anything. So I think the passivity of trying not to do anything to help these movements, had we tried from the beginning, we could have perhaps have guided. Even if we lost a few, if we'd done better, at least it wouldn't have been as bad. And by not doing anything in Syria, since you mentioned it, we allowed the Russians to move in, which they did last fall, a year ago. And now it's becoming more difficult, and it's more complex than ever not to have dealt with it earlier. Sometimes people always say, it's always best to use force as a last resort. Sometimes it's not easy, but sometimes it's better to use it at the beginning when it's unclear and a situation can be more amenable to being influenced. Once it begins too far down the pike, it's too complex, it's too far down the road, and it's very hard to retrieve and turn it back again into ways that the United States would want.
Do you see it as unlikely or very complicated or difficult to intervene at this stage? I mean, could you create a no-fly zone or a safe zone for refugees or some of the other, more minor suggestions that are out there at the moment?
Well, no, I think that the suggestion for no-fly zones and humanitarian zones or humanitarian havens was a good one. And if I had done that, I think it would have changed a lot of things on the ground, because these poor people fleeing Syria would have had a place to go. And, of course, would have taken off the burden of all of the refugees flooding into Europe, as has happened. I think it can still be done. The concern, of course, is that if they backfire somehow, or if something goes wrong, there could be a conflict with the Russians who are flying in the same areas. But that hasn't happened yet. It could happen. Right. And if it did happen, I don't think anyone would be too surprised we couldn't have some sort of plane shot down inadvertently or because of mixed signals. But I think if some sort of humanitarian zones are absolutely necessary. And also I think we have to recognize that Syria will never go back together again. And we have to think about what happened in Yugoslavia in the 1990s, where it split apart into several countries. There was a great movement against that. The United States is one of those countries that said, no, we have to keep Yugoslavia together. But once it became apparent this couldn't happen, and I think the same thing will probably happen in Syria. It's too far down the pike to reconstitute it, and perhaps it'll be better that if we had different countries emerge, or different mini-states emerge in Syria today, and that will mean at least it would wind down some of the fighting, and people who belong to one sect or another sect go to those areas and might minimize some of the terrible scenes that are coming out of Syria.
It's interesting that you mentioned Yugoslavia, because it's been on my mind. I watched a very good documentary recently called The Diplomat about Richard Holbrooke. And it has come up in some conversations, this idea that the U.S. has become very reliant on military, and they are not supporting the diplomatic corps and the State Department, I guess, as much as they might. And even people like Richard Holbrooke don't have contemporaries in Washington today. How do you feel about that? Do you think that's fair criticism?
Yes, I think Holbrooke did a fantastic job. He was the right personality for the right time. I think he could knock heads. He could make people do things. He got them going. He was perfect for the job. He was, as you know, before he died, was brought in by the Obama administration in a kind of special envoy role toward Pakistan. But by accounts, of his own aide, a man by the name of Ali Nasser, in a book about that experience, was very bitter. He, toward the administration, thought that Holbrooke was repeatedly demeaned. The rug was pulled out from under him when he was trying to negotiate something involving not just Pakistan and Afghanistan, but a kind of greater regional solution to the problems emerging out of Afghanistan, of which there are, because Pakistan is threatened by it. India is concerned, Russia, and also Iran, or all have strong interest in what happens in Afghanistan, and I think Holbrooke understood that. But since then, there's been no one really in that caliber who stepped forward, nor does he have the support of the administration. Again, it's this kind of retrenchment attitude, but we're just going to pull out. We're not going to try to deal with some of these issues, and it's unfortunate. You might fail, but at least if you tried more, you could have a satisfaction. We did try. It didn't work, but we tried. But I don't think there's been that effort put into it.
Right. So just coming back to Syria, I want to close this loop a little bit. A lot of the things I'm hearing now are we've essentially surrendered the influence in the region. The U.S. has surrendered their influence in the region to Russia, and the peace in Syria will be a Russian peace. So do you buy that and that kind of narrative? And what do you think that means for U.S.-Russia relationships going forward?
Well, temporarily, it does look like a Russian success. You can't project history too far because, if, for example, and Angela Merkel makes this point, yes, the Soviets, the Russians, the Soviets occupied Western Europe for 4 decades, and eventually their power became weak because of their communist system, and they ultimately collapsed and they had to pull out. So that's could possibly happen in Syria. It could happen even sooner. But Russian power but at least in the immediacy, yes, it looks very bad. But it looks like the Russians are dictating that they are the most important player in Syria, and the United States has taken a more backward role. Now, maybe some people say, the administration is playing the long game, or waiting for the Russians to overextend themselves. It'll cost them too much money. They'll become bogged down, as many people thought. But in the immediacy, it doesn't look good for the United States. Now, it may play out along those lines, but something will happen. It also makes, again, the same thing has happened in Asia and happened in Eastern Europe. Everyone has their finger in the air to test the wind which way it's blowing. And I think the administration did do some things about sending some troops back to the Baltic, small numbers, and some small contingents were sent. I think it would have been better if they'd have done it with a little more bravado, a little more forcefully, that a few armored divisions sent back to Germany would have been much more important than just sending a few training battalions to places like Poland and Lithuania. But it would have sent a stronger signal that that NATO has to, in fact, be protected. And the United States is a major player in NATO and is not going to watch it be taken over or pushed aside by the Kremlin.
The comment that we're, I guess, headed for a new Cold War with Russia. Do you buy that?
I think I think it's not a Cold War because we don't have an ideological component as we did in the Cold War. I think it's more back to the 19th century, or the early 20th century. We have major players in the world with alliances shifting. It's more power politics. And if you want to have a look at what happens, look at Europe and Russia before 1914. Let's say the 20 years, 30 years before that, from the 1870s forward, and see how these various powers jockey among themselves, the British and the French on one side, the Germans looking for alliances, looking not to be left out. Bismarck, when he was in power, constantly concerned about a two-front war, one with Russia and one with France at the same time. These powers are looking around, and has less to do with ideology and it does simply power politics and almost a great chessboard. Who's going to move where and who's going to do what. And it sort of gives it a kind of 19th century flavor rather than this strong Cold War. You could recall in the Cold War, we dueled with the Soviets and everything. Olympic sports, chess matches, concert pianists, everything across the board. That doesn't seem to be the same kind of strong ideological component. So as I say, it's more power politics.
So we must tell the Stanford chess team to stand down.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so the one thing that is certain in the world is that we've spoken a lot about the current administration, but in the next few weeks we're going to get a new administration. So you've obviously been through a few presidents. Looking at the different foreign policies of, I guess, President Clinton or a potential President Trump, on the other hand, how do you see the administrations tackling some of these big issues we've been talking about today?
Well, it's my assumption that American foreign policy, and I have a book on this coming out, dealing with how American foreign policy cycles. And if you look back, starting even in the 1930s, America was very much an isolationist power, pulled back. Then it was dragged into world affairs by the Pearl Harbor attack and then by the Soviet expansion in Eastern Europe and around the world. We were forced to stand up. But during even the Cold War, we had lapses where we began to pull back. After the Vietnam War, which was America's most frustrating war, the United States pulled back under both Nixon and Jimmy Carter, and Reagan reasserted American power, and so did George Herbert Walker Bush. Clinton was more reserved, and George Walker Bush was much more extravagant in use of power, and I think President Obama's been more hesitant, more retrenchment-minded. So American policy is a little bit like a pendulum. It swings in and out. So whoever wins in the next few weeks the presidency, I'm thinking that they will be more engaged. It will swing back again. And I think despite the so-called rumors between Trump and being friendly to Putin, I think they're too much alike actually to get along. So, but if Hillary Clinton wins, I think that her foreign policy team will become more extrovert, more engaged than Obama. I think that's been predicted, and by looking about some of the personality she might bring in, that's an assumption that many observers have made, that it will be a different kind of foreign policy, that Obama perhaps overcorrected too much for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and now there has to be brought back somewhere. It's a little bit like Goldilocks. It can't be too hot, can't be too cold. It has to be more sort of in the middle. And so we're looking for the pendulum to swing back, at least partially, toward more American engagement in international affairs.
I have this theory about a Clinton presidency, because a number of the foreign policy experts in the U.S. signed a bunch of these letters that they would not support Trump and they wouldn't support a Trump presidency. I mean, one of the ideas is that the foreign policy community is more open to a future President Clinton than almost any Democratic president has ever had the option. She has the ability to pick the eyes, if you like, out of the foreign policy community, and really could assemble an amazing team as a result of that. Does that make sense?
I think there are. I think within the Democratic Party there is a certain disenchantment, and not at the extreme, but the more centrist part of the Democratic Party, I think there is some disenchantment with Obama. They don't want to say it too publicly, but right. You can see that around the edges there are hints that this has perhaps gone, as I say, an overcorrection too far.
Okay, so I mean, just two last things. If the U.S. gets more involved, I mean, a lot of your work has been around kind of some of these rogue states, North Korea, Iran. There is a lot of concern in the world at the moment with the U.S. getting less engaged about nuclear and there being a nuclear accident, the rise of nuclear powers. How do you see the policy changing towards North Korea and Iran and some of these states?
I think that the problem with North Korea, it's a little bit like Syria in the sense that had we moved earlier, it might have been easier. Now it's going to be more difficult. And the reason it is so, I wrote a book on American rogue states, and I tried not to make it just a polemical about all the things that are done wrong, but really look at rogue states in the past, way distant past, going way back to classical times. And rogue states are not destined to last very long. Almost all of them go by the wayside. And that's certainly happening with contemporary rogue states. We used to have more of them. We used to have rogue states in places like Sudan. Even Cuba at one point was considered a rogue state. And they're very dependent after a while. They can be a rogue for a while, but the history is sooner or later they have to seek some sort of shelter under the eaves of a great power. And I think in the case of Korea, North Korea, they still cause the Chinese a lot of problems. But the Chinese, since Xi Jinping came into office in 2014, they're not going to see North Korea go down. It's too important. Now that the Chinese are caught up with this dual struggle with the United States in the last 2 years over the South China Sea, Korea is no longer just simply an outlier, an isolated country that they don't want to see it go. They never wanted to see it go down anyway because it was a fraternal communist power. Second, there was always a concern that if it collapsed and there was a civil war erupted or some sort of implosion, that there would be refugees that would go north into China. I always thought that was overdrawn, that many would go south into South Korea. Afterwards, they speak the same language. They've got relatives in the south. But it would be dislocative if North Korea collapsed for China. Now I think it's more difficult. And if we wanted to deal with North Korea, I don't think we'll get we can't stop them getting nuclear weapons or nuclear weapons that are capable of being projected on missiles. They do have some nuclear weapons capacity. They now have the only way to deal with that would have been through Chinese banks and Chinese financial institutions. That would have been their Achilles heel, as we did with Iran. That's what worked with Iran, I think, with the agreement they finally had to come to terms. That's over now. I don't think the Chinese are going to go along with that. They will do enough to keep North Korea somewhat under control, but they won't be our allies. So North Korea will get nuclear weapons, and we'll have to resort to some sort of classic deterrence. The idea that we can do another treaty like we did with Iran, with North Korea, won't work. North Koreans will not give up their nuclear weapons. They will not stop. Right. Iran had a different set of circumstances. And so we're not even sure if it's going to completely play out the way we want with Iran. We have to wait and see. One of the assumptions of the Iran deal that was signed in the summer of 2015 was that it would be integrated into the world community. It would become more of a conventional power. That it would see the benefits of trade and cooperation. But that is not the case of North Korea. North Korea doesn't care about those things.
So I've got one last question. What do you think is the one issue, the one foreign policy question that is the most overlooked and we should be trying to find an answer to?
I think the idea how to deal with failed states, because there are a lot of them now, and they seem to be multiplying. Some of these states are enormously fragile, that they have to be, and I think we have to find a way it's kind of cost effective. We did it so badly in Afghanistan and Iraq. We spent millions and billions of dollars on all kinds of construction projects and all kinds of training projects. And I think a lot of money was wasted. It was siphoned off by contractors. It was misspent. There was some corruption involved by local officials. But we have to find a way of doing it, because as these states melt down, and because they're so fragile, then they cause us enormous problems. And we haven't really given enough. It's out of vogue to speak about nation building. Nobody wants to do that. They've used all kinds of terms now, stabilizing. We're trying to do state building. But we have to find a way that is cost effective, in a way that is somewhat successful over a period of time. And then we have to have a second part, sustaining power. How are we going to stay there for a while? And how we do it without looking like a colonial power. That is not easy to do. And it takes a lot of subtlety. And I don't know, subtlety is always a part of American foreign policy. Sometimes we're not as effective, where some powers, I think, are just better at it than we are.
Thomas Henriksen, thank you very much for coming to Blindspot.